In every quiet town, behind every locked door, something lingers, waiting to be remembered. These are the stories whispered in the dark. True or not, they stay with you just the same. Welcome to the Fright Brothers, where the living tell the tales, and the dead refuse to forget.
Welcome back to the Fright Brothers podcast. Here is part 2 of Algernon Blackwood's The Wendigo. The sudden entrance of his prosaic uncle into this world of wizardry and horror that had haunted him without interruption now for 2 days and 2 nights had the immediate effect of giving into the affair an entirely new aspect. The sound of that crisp, "Hello, my boy, and what's up now?" and the grasp of that dry and vigorous hand introduced another standard of judgment. A revulsion of feeling washed through him. He had realized that he had let himself go rather badly. He even felt vaguely ashamed of himself. The native hard-headedness of his race reclaimed him, and this doubtless explains why he found it so hard to tell the group around the fire everything. He told enough, however, for the immediate decision to be arrived at that a relief party must start at the earliest possible moment, and that Simpson, in order to guide it capably, must first have food and above all sleep. Dr. Cathcart, observing the lad's condition more shrewdly than his patient knew, gave him a very slight injection of morphine. For 6 hours he slept like the dead. From the description carefully written out afterwards by the student of divinity, it appears that the account he gave to the astonished group omitted sundry vital and important details. He declares that with his uncle's wholesome matter-of-fact countenance staring him in the face, he simply had not the courage to mention them. Thus, all the search party gathered, it would seem, was that Defago had suffered in the night an acute and inexplicable attack of mania, and had imagined himself called by someone or something, and had plunged into the bush after it without food or rifle, where he must die a horrible and lingering death by the cold and starvation unless he could be found and rescued in time. In time, moreover, meant at once. In the course of the following day, however, they were off by 7, leaving Punk in charge with the instructions to have food and fire always ready. Simpson found it possible to tell his uncle a good deal more of the story's true inwardness, without divining that it was drawn out of him as a matter of fact by a very subtle form of cross-examination. By the time they reached the beginning of the trail, where the canoe was laid up against the return journey, he had mentioned how Defago spoke vaguely of something called a Wendigo. How he cried in his sleep, how he imagined an unusual scent about the camp, and had betrayed other symptoms of mental excitement. He also admitted the bewildering effect of that extraordinary odor upon himself, pungent and acrid like the odor of lions. And by the time they were within an easy hour of 50 Island Water, he had let slip the further fact, a foolish avowal of his own hysterical condition, as he felt afterwards, that he had heard the vanished guide call for help. He omitted the singular phrases used, for he simply could not bring himself to repeat the preposterous language. Also, while describing how the man's footsteps in the snow gradually assumed an exact miniature likeness of the animal's plunging tracks, he left out the fact that they measured a wholly incredible distance. It seemed a question nicely balanced between individual pride and honesty, what he should reveal and what suppress. He mentioned the fiery tinge of the snow, for instance, yet shrank from telling that body and bed had been partly dragged out of the tent. With the net result that Dr. Cathcart, adroit psychologist that he fancied himself to be, had assured him clearly enough exactly where his mind, influenced by loneliness, bewilderment, and terror, had yielded to the strain and invited delusion. While praising his conduct, he managed at the same time to point out where, when, and how his mind had gone astray. He made his nephew think himself finer than he was by judicious praise, yet more foolish than he was by minimizing the value of the evidence. Like many another materialist, that is, he lied cleverly on the basis of insufficient knowledge, because the knowledge supplied seemed to his own particular intelligence inadmissible. "A spell of these terrible solitudes," he said, "cannot leave any mind untouched, any mind, that is, possessed of the higher imaginative qualities. It had worked upon yours exactly as it had worked upon my own when I was at your age. The animal that haunted your little camp was undoubtedly a moose. for the bellying of the moose may have, sometimes, a peculiar quality of sound. The colored appearance of the big tracks was obviously a defect of vision in your own eyes produced by excitement. The size and stretch of the tracks we shall prove when we come to them. But the hallucination of an audible voice, of course, is one of most commonest forms of delusion due to mental excitement. An excitement, my dear boy, perfectly excusable, and, let me add, wonderfully controlled by you under the circumstances. For the rest, I am bound to say you have acted with splendid courage. For the terror of feeling oneself lost in the wilderness is nothing short of awful, and had I been in your place, I don't for a moment believe I could have behaved with 1/4 of your wisdom and decision. The only thing I find it uncommonly difficult to explain is that damned odor. It made me feel sick, I assure you, declared his nephew. Positively dizzy. His uncle's attitude of calm omniscience, merely because he knew more psychological formulae, made him slightly defiant. It was so easy to be wise in the explanation of an experience one had not personally witnessed. A kind of desolate and terrible odor is the only way I can describe it, he concluded, glancing at the features of the quiet, unemotional man beside him. I can only marvel, was the reply, that under the circumstance it did not seem to you even worse. The dry words, Simpson knew, hovered between the truth and his uncle's interpretation of the truth. And so at last they came to the little camp and found the tent still standing, the remains of the fire, and the piece of paper pinned to the stake beside it, untouched. The cache, poorly contrived by inexperienced hands, however, had been discovered and opened by muskrats, minks, and squirrels. The matches lay scattered about the opening, but the food had been taken to the last crumb. Well, fellers, he ain't here, exclaimed Hank loudly after his fashion, and that's as certain as the coal supply down below. But where he's got to by this time is about as uncertain as the trading crowns to other place. The presence of a divinity student was no barrier to his language at such time, but for the reader's sake it may be severely edited. I propose, he added, that we start out and hunt for him at once like hell. The gloom of Defago's probable fate oppressed the whole party with a sense of dreadful gravity the moment they saw the familiar signs of recent occupancy. Especially the tent, with a bed of balsam branches still smoothed and flattened by the presence of his body, seemed to bring his presence near to them. Simpson, feeling vaguely as if his world were somehow at stake, went about explaining particulars in his hushed tone. He was much calmer now, though, overwearied with the strain of his many journeys. His uncle's method of explaining away, rather, the details still fresh in his haunted memory helped, too, to put ice upon his emotions. And that's the direction he ran off in, he said to his two companions, pointing in the direction where the guide had vanished that morning in the gray dawn. Straight down there he ran like a deer, in between the birch and the hemlock. Hank and Dr. Cathcart exchanged glances. And it was about 2 miles down in a straight line, he continued the other, speaking with something of the former terror in his voice, that I followed his trail to the place where it stopped, dead. And where you heard him calling and caught the stench and all that rest of the wicked entertainment? Cried Hank, with an involubility that betrayed his keen distress. And where your excitement overcame you to the point of producing illusions, added Dr. Cathcart under his breath, yet not so low that his nephew did not hear it. It was early in afternoon, for they had traveled quick, and there were still a good 2 hours of daylight left. Dr. Cathcart and Hank lost no time in beginning the search, but Simpson was too exhausted to accompany them. They would follow the blazed marks on the trees, and where possible his footsteps. Meanwhile, the best thing he could do was to keep a good fire going and rest. But after something like 3 hours' search, the darkness already down, the two men returned to camp with nothing to report. Fresh snow had covered all the signs, and though they had followed the blazed trees to the spot where Simpson had turned back, they had not discovered the smallest indication of a human being, or for that matter, an animal. There were no fresh tracks of any kind. The snow lay undisturbed. It was difficult to know what was best to do, though in reality there was nothing more they could do. They might stay and search for weeks without much chance of success. The fresh snow destroyed their only hope, and they gathered round the fire for supper, a gloomy and despondent party. The facts, indeed, were sad enough, for Defago had a wife at Rat Portage, and his earnings were his family's sole means of support. Now that the whole truth and all its ugliness was out, it seemed useless to deal in further disguise or pretense. They talked openly of the facts and probabilities. It was not the first time, even in the experience of Dr. Cathcart, that a man had yielded to the singular seduction of the solitudes and had gone out of his mind. Defago, moreover, was predisposed to something of the sort, for he had already had a touch of melancholia in his blood, and his fiber was weakened by the bouts of drinking that often lasted for weeks at a time. Something on this trip one might never know precisely had sufficed to push him over the line, that was all. And he had gone off into the great wilderness of trees and lakes to die by starvation and exhaustion. The chances against finding the camp again were overwhelming. The delirium that was upon him would also doubtless have increased, and it was quite likely he might do violence to himself and so hasten his cruel fate. Even while they talked, indeed, the end had probably come. On the suggestion of Hank, his old pal, however, they proposed to wait a little longer and devote the whole of the following day, from dawn to darkness, to the most systematic search they could devise. They would divide the territory between them. They discussed their plan in great detail. All that men could do, they would do. And meanwhile, they talked about the particular form in which the singular panic of the wilderness had made its attack upon the mind of the unfortunate guide. Hank, though familiar with the legend in its general outline, obviously did not welcome the turn the conversation had taken. He contributed little, though that little was illuminating. For he admitted that a story ran all over this section of the country to the effect that several Indians had seen the Wendigo along the shores of 50 Island Water in the fall of last year, and that was the true reason of Defago's disinclination to hunt there. Hank doubtless felt that he had in a sense helped his old pal to death by over-persuading him. "When an Indian goes crazy," he explained, to himself more than to the others it seemed, "it's always to put that he's seen the Wendigo, and poor old Defago was superstitious down to the very heels." And then Simpson, feeling the atmosphere more sympathetic, told over again the full story of his astonishing tale. He left out no details this time. He mentioned his own sensations and gripping fear. He only admitted the strange language used. "But Defago surely had already told you all these details of the Wendigo legend, my dear fellow," insisted the doctor. "I mean, he had talked about it, and thus put into your mind the ideas which your own excitement afterwards developed?" Whereupon Simpson again repeated the facts. Defago, he declared, had barely mentioned the beast. He, Simpson, knew nothing of the story, and so far as he remembered, he had never even read about it. Even the word was unfamiliar. Of course he was telling the truth, and Dr. Cathcart was reluctantly compelled to admit the singular character of the whole affair. He did not do this in words so much as in manner, however. He kept his back against a good stout tree, poked the fire into a blaze the moment it showed signs of dying. He was quicker than any of them to notice the least sound of the night about them: a fish jumping in the lake, a twig snapping in the bush, the dropping of occasional fragments of frozen snow from the branches overhead, where the heat loosened him. His voice, too, changed a little in quality, becoming a shade less confident, lower also in tone. Fear, to put it plainly, hovered close about the little camp, and though all three would have been glad to speak of other matters, the only thing they seemed to be able to discuss was this, the source of their fear. They tried other subjects in vain. There was nothing to say about them. Hank was the most honest of the group. He said next to nothing. He never once, however, turned his back to the darkness. His face was always to the forest, and when the wood was needed, he didn't go farther than was necessary to get it. A wall of silence wrapped them in, for the snow, though not thick, was sufficient to deaden any noise, and the frost held things pretty tight besides. No sound but their voices and the soft roar of the flames made itself heard. Only, from time to time, something soft as the flutter of a pine moth's wings went past them through the air. No one seemed anxious to go to bed. The hour slipped towards midnight. "The legend is picturesque enough," observed the doctor, after one of the longer pauses, speaking to break it rather than because he had anything to say. "For the Wendigo is simply the call of the wild personified, which some natures hear to their own destruction." "That's about it," Hank said presently. "And there's no misunderstanding it when you hear it. It calls you by name right enough." Another pause followed. Then Dr. Cathcart came back to the forbidden subject with a rush that made the others jump. "The allegory is significant," he remarked, looking about him into the darkness. "For the voice, they say, resembles all the minor sounds of the bush, wind, falling water, cries of the animals, and so forth. And once the victim hears that, he's off for good, of course. His most vulnerable points, moreover, are said to be the feet and the eyes. The feet you see for the lust of wandering, and the eyes for the lust of beauty. The poor beggar goes at such dreadful speed that he bleeds beneath the eyes and his feet burn." Dr. Cathcart, as he spoke, continued to peer uneasily into the surrounding gloom. His voice sank to a hushed tone. "The Wendigo," he added, "is said to burn his feet, owing to the friction apparently caused by its tremendous velocity, till they drop off, and new ones form exactly like its own." Simpson listened in horrified amazement, but it was the pallor of Hank's face that fascinated him most. He would willingly have stopped his ears and closed his eyes had he dared. "It don't always keep to the ground neither," came in Hank's slow and heavy drawl, "for it goes so high that he thinks the stars will set him all afire. And it'll take the great thumping jumps, sometimes run along the tops of the trees carrying its partner with it, and then dropping them just as a fish hawk will drop a pickerel to kill it before eating it. And it's food. All the muck in the whole bush is moss." And he laughed in a short, unnatural laugh. "It's a moss eater, is the Wendigo," he added, looking up excitedly into the faces of his companion. "Moss eater," he repeated with a string of the most outlandish oaths he could invent. But Simpson now understood the true purpose of all this talk. What these two men, each strong and experienced in his own ways, dreaded more than anything else was silence. They were talking against time. They were also talking against darkness, against the invasion of panic, against the admission reflection might bring that they were in the enemy's country, against anything. In fact, rather than allow their innermost thought to assume control, he himself, already initiated by the awful vigil with terror, was beyond both of them in this respect. He had reached the stage where he was immune. But these two, the scoffing analytical doctor and the honest dog backwoodsman, each sat trembling in the depths of his being. Thus 3 hours passed, and thus, with lowered voices and a kind of taut inner resistance of spirit, this little group of humanity sat in the jaws of the wilderness and talked foolishly of the terrible and haunting legend. It was an unequal contest, all things considered, for the wilderness had already the advantage of the first attack, and of a hostage. The fate of their comrade hung over them with a steadily increasing weight of oppression that finally became insupportable. It was Hank, after a pause longer than the preceding ones that no one seemed able to break, who first let loose all this pent-up emotion in a very unexpected fashion. By springing suddenly to his feet and letting out the most ear-shattering yell imaginable into the night, he could not contain himself any longer, it seemed. To make it carry even beyond an ordinary cry, he interrupted its rhythm by shaking the palms of his hands before his mouth. "That's for Defago," he said, looking down at the other two with a queer, defiant laugh. "For it's my belief, the sandwich oaths may be admitted, that my old partner's not far from us at this very moment." There was a vehemence and a recklessness about his performance that made Simpson, too, start to his feet in amazement and betrayed even the doctor into letting the pipe slip from between his lips. Hank's face was ghastly, but Cathcart's showed a sudden weakness, a loosening of all his faculties, as it were. Then a momentary anger blazed into his eyes, and he too, though with deliberation born of habitual self-control, got upon his feet and faced the excited guide. For this was unpermissible, foolish, dangerous, and he meant to stop it in the bud. What might have happened in the next minute or two one may speculate about, yet never definitively know. For in the instance of profound silence that followed Hank's roaring voice, and though as in answer to it, something went past through the darkness of the sky overhead at terrific speed, something of necessity very large, for it displaced much air, while down between the trees there fell a faint and windy cry of a human voice, calling in tones of indescribable anguish and appeal. "Oh, oh, this fiery height! Oh, oh, my feet of fire! My burning feet!" White to the very edge of his shirt, Hank looked stupidly about him like a child. Dr. Cathcart uttered some kind of unintelligible cry, turning as he did with an instinctive moment of blind terror towards the protection of the tent, then halting in the act as though frozen. Simpson, alone of the three, retained his presence of mind a little. His own horror was too deep to allow any immediate reaction. He had heard that cry before. Turning to his stricken companions, he said almost calmly, "That's exactly the cry I heard, the very words he used." Then lifting his face to the sky, he cried out aloud, "Defago! Defago! Come down here to us! Come down!" And before there was any time for anyone to take definite action one way or another, there came the sound of something dropping heavily between the trees, striking the branches on the way down, and landing with a dreadful thud upon the frozen earth below. The crash and thunder of it was really terrific. "That's him, so help me the good God!" came from Hank in a whispering cry, half choked, his hand going automatically toward the hunting knife in his belt. "And he's coming! He's coming!" he added with an irrational laugh of horror, as the sounds of heavy footsteps crunching over the snow became distinctly audible, the approaching through the blackness towards the circle of light. And while the steps, with their stumbling motion, moved nearer and nearer upon them, the three men stood round that fire, motionless and dumb. Dr. Cathcart had the appearance of a man suddenly withered. Even his eyes did not move. Hank, suffering shockingly, seemed on the verge again of violent action, yet did nothing. He, too, was hewn of stone. Like stricken children they seemed. The picture was hideous, and meanwhile, their owner still invisible, the footsteps came closer, crunching the frozen snow. It was endless, too prolonged to be quite real, this measured and pitiless approach. It was accursed.
Then at length the darkness, having laboriously conceived, brought forth a figure. It drew forward into the zone of uncertain light, where fire and shadow mingled. Not 10 feet away, then halted, staring at them fixedly. The same instant it started forward again with a spasmodic motion as of a thing moved by wires, and coming up closer to them, full into the glare of the fire, they perceived then that it was a man, and apparently that this man was Defago. Something like a skin of horror almost perceptibly drew down in that very moment over every face, and 3 pairs of eyes shone through it as though they saw across the frontiers of normal vision into the unknown. Defago advanced, his tread faltering and uncertain. He made his way straight up to them as a group first, then turned sharply and peered close into the face of Simpson. The sound of a voice issued from his lips.
"Here I am, Boss Simpson. I heard someone calling me."
It was a faint, dried-up voice, made wheezy and breathless, as by immense exertion.
"I'm having a regular hellfire kind of trip, I am."
And he laughed, thrusting his head forward into the other's face. But that laugh started the machinery of the group of waxwork figures with wax-white skins. Hank immediately sprang forward with a stream of oaths so far-fetched that Simpson did not recognize them as English at all, but thought he had lapsed into Indian or some other lingo. He only realized that Hank's presence, thrust thus between them, was welcome, uncommonly welcome. Dr. Cathcart, though, more calmly and leisurely, advanced behind him, heavily stumbling. Simpson seems hazy as to what was actually said and done in those next few seconds. For the eyes of that detestable and blasted visage, peering at such close quarters into his own, utterly bewildered his senses at first. He merely stood there. He said nothing. He had not the trained will of the older men that forced them into action in defiance of all emotional stress. He watched them moving as behind a glass that half destroyed their reality. It was dreamlike, perverted. Yet, through the torrent of Hank's meaningless phrases, he remembers hearing his uncle's tone of authority, hard and forced, saying several things about food and warmth, blankets, whiskey, and the rest, and further, that whiffs of the penetrating, unaccustomed odor, vile yet sweetly bewildering, assailed his nostrils during all that followed. It was no less a person than himself, however, less experienced and adroit than others, though he was, who gave instinctive utterance to the sentence that brought a measure of relief into that ghastly situation by expressing the doubt and thought in each one's heart.
"It is you, isn't it, Defago?"
he asked, under his breath, horror breaking his speech. And at once Cathcart burst out with a loud answer before the other had time to move his lips.
"Of course it is, of course it is. Only, can't you see, he's nearly dead with exhaustion, cold, and terror. Isn't that enough to change a man beyond all recognition?"
It was said in order to convince himself as much as to convince the others. The overemphasis alone proved that, and continually, while he spoke and acted, he held a handkerchief to his nose. That odor pervaded the whole camp. For the Defago who sat huddled by the big fire, wrapped in blankets, drinking hot whiskey and holding food in wasted hands, was no more like the guide they had last seen alive when the picture of a man of 60 is like a daguerreotype of his early youth in the costume of another generation. Nothing really can describe that ghastly caricature, that parody, masquerading there in the firelight as Defago. From the ruins of the dark and awful memory he still retains, Simpson declares that the face was more animal than human, the features drawn about it into wrong proportions, the skin loose and hanging, as though he had been subjected to extraordinary pressures and tensions. It made him think vaguely of those bladder faces, blown up by the hawkers on Ludgate Hill, that change their expression as they swell, and as they collapse emit a faint and wailing imitation of a voice. Both face and voice suggested some abominable resemblance, but Cathcart, long afterwards, seeking to describe the indescribable, asserts that thus might have looked a face and body that had been in air so rarefied that the weight of the atmosphere being removed, the entire structure threatened to fly asunder and become incoherent. It was Hank, though, all distraught and shaking with a tearing volume of emotion that he could neither handle nor understand, who brought things to a head without much ado. He went off to a little distance from the fire, apparently so that the light should not dazzle him too much, and shading his eyes for a moment with both hands, shouted in a loud voice that held anger and affection dreadfully mingled. "You ain't Defago! You ain't Defago at all! I don't give a damn, but that ain't you, my old pal of 20 years. He glared upon the huddled figure as though he would destroy him with his eyes. "And if it is, I'll swab the floor of hell with a wad of cotton wool on a toothpick, so help me God," he added with a violent fling of horror and disgust. It was impossible to silence him. He stood there shouting like one possessed, horrible to see, horrible to hear, because it was the truth. He repeated himself in 50 different ways, each more outlandish than the last. The woods rang with echoes. At one time it looked as if he meant to fling himself upon the intruder, for his hand continually jerked towards the long hunting knife on his belt. But in the end he did nothing, and the whole tempest completed itself very shortly with tears. Hank's voice suddenly broke, he collapsed on the ground, and Cathcart somehow or other persuaded him at last to go into the tent and lie quiet. The remainder of the affair, indeed, was witnessed by him from behind the canvas, his white and terrified face peeping through the crack of the tent door flap. Then Dr. Cathcart, closely followed by his nephew, who so far had kept his courage better than all of them, went up with a determined air and stood opposite the figure of Defago, huddled over the fire. He looked him squarely in the face and spoke. At first his voice was firm.
"Defago, tell us what has happened, just a little, so that we can know how best to help you,"
he asked in a tone of authority, almost of command, and at that point it was command. At once afterwards, however, it changed in quality, for the figure turned up to him with a face so piteous, so terrible, and so little like humanity, that the doctor shrank back from him as from something spiritually unclean. Simpson, watching close behind him, says he got the impression of a mask that was on the verge of dropping off, and that underneath they would discover something black and diabolical, revealed in utter nakedness.
"Out with it, man! Out with it!"
Cathcart cried, terror running neck and neck with entreaty.
"None of us can stand this much longer."
It was the cry of instinct over reason. And then Defago, smiling whitely, answered in that thin and fading voice that had already seemed passing over into the sound of quite another character.
"It seems that the great Wendigo is a thing,"
he whispered, sniffing the air about him exactly like an animal.
"I've been with it too."
Whether the poor devil would have said more, or whether Dr. Cathcart would have continued the impossible cross-examination cannot be known. For at that moment the voice of Hank was heard yelling at the top of his voice from behind the canvas that concealed all but his terrified eyes. Such a howling was never heard. "His feet of fire! Oh God, his feet! Look at his great changed feet!" Defago, shuffling where he had sat, had moved in such a way that for the first time his legs were in full light and his feet were visible. Yet Simpson had no time, himself, to see properly what Hank had seen, and Hank was never seen fit to tell. That same instant, with a leap like that of a frightened tiger, Cathcart was upon him, bundling the folds of blankets about his legs, with such speed that the young student caught little more than a passing glimpse of something dark and oddly masked. But then before the doctor had time to do more, or Simpson to even think a question, much less ask it, DeFago was standing upright in front of them, balancing with pain and difficulty, and upon his shapeless and twisted visage an expression so dark and so malicious that it was, in the true sense, monstrous.
"Now you have seen it too," he wheezed. "You've seen my fiery burning feet. And now, letters, unless you can save me and prevent, it's about time for—"
His piteous and beseeching voice was interrupted by a sound that was like a roar of wind coming across the lake. The trees overhead shook their tangled branches. The blazing fire bent its flames as before a blast, and something swept with a terrific rushing noise about the little camp and seemed to surround it entirely in a single moment of time. DeFago shook the clinging blankets from his body, turned toward the woods behind, and with the same stumbling motion that brought him, he was gone. Gone before anyone could move a muscle to prevent him. Gone with an amazing, blundering swiftness that left no time to act. The darkness positively swallowed him, and less than a dozen seconds later, above the roar of the swaying trees and the shout of the sudden wind, all three men, watching and listening with stricken hearts, heard a cry that seemed to drop down upon them from a great height of sky and distance.
"Oh, this fiery height! Oh, my feet of fire! My burning feet of fire!"
Then died away into untold space and silence. Dr. Cathcart, suddenly master of himself, and therefore the others, was just able to seize Hank violently by the arm as he tried to dash headlong into the bush. "But I want her know, you," shrieked the guide. "I want her see, that ain't him at all, but some devil that shunted in his place." Somehow or other, he admits he never quite knew how he accomplished it, he managed to keep him in the tent and pacify him. The doctor, apparently, had reached a stage where reaction had set in and allowed his own innate force to conquer. Certainly he managed Hank admirably. It was his nephew, however, hitherto so wonderfully controlled, who gave him most cause for anxiety, for the cumulative strain had now produced a condition like lachrymose hysteria, which made it necessary to isolate him upon a bed of boughs and blankets as far removed from Hank as was possible under the circumstance. And there he lay, as the watches of that haunted night passed over the lonely camp, crying startled sentences, and fragments of sentences, into the folds of his blanket. A quantity of gibberish about speed and height and fire mingled oddly with biblical memories of the classroom. "People with broken faces, all on fire, are coming at most awful pace towards the camp," he would moan one minute, and with the next would sit up and stare into the woods, intently listening, and whisper, "How terrible in the wilderness are the feet of them that—" until his uncle came across to change the direction of his thoughts and comfort him. The hysteria, fortunately, proved but temporary. Sleep cured him, just as it cured Hank. Till the first signs of daylight came, soon after 5 o'clock, Dr. Cathcart kept his vigil. His face was the color of chalk, and there were strange flushes beneath his eyes. An appalling terror of the soul battled with his will all through those silent hours. These were some of the outer signs. At dawn he lit the fire himself, made breakfast, and woke the others, and by 7 they were well on their way back to home camp. 3 perplexed and afflicted men, but each in his own way having reduced his inner turmoil to a condition of more or less systemized order again. They talked little, and then only for the most wholesome and common things, for their minds were charged with painful thoughts that clamored for explanation, though no one dared to refer to them. Hank, being nearest to primitive conditions, was the first to find himself, for he was also less complex. And Dr. Cathcart's civilization championed his forces against an attack singular enough. To this day, perhaps, he is not quite sure of certain things. Anyhow, he took longer to find himself. Simpson, the student of divinity, it was who arranged his conclusions probably with the best, though not most scientific appearance of order. Out there, in the heart of unreclaimed wilderness, they had surely witnessed something crudely and essentially primitive, something that had survived somehow the advance of humanity, and had emerged terrifically, betraying a scale of life still monstrous and immature. He envisaged it rather as a glimpse into the prehistoric ages, when superstitions, gigantic and uncouth, still oppressed the hearts of men, when the forces of nature were still untamed, the powers that may have haunted a primeval universe not yet withdrawn. To this day he thinks of what he termed years later in a sermon as savage and formidable potencies lurking behind the souls of men, not evil perhaps in themselves, yet instinctively hostile to humanity as it exists. With his uncle he never discussed the matter in detail, for the barrier between the two types of mind made it difficult. Only once, years later, something led them to that frontier of the subject, of a single detail of the subject rather.
"Can you tell me what they were like?"
he asked, and the reply, though conceived in wisdom, was not encouraging.
"It is far better you try not to know or to find out."
"Well, that odor," persisted the nephew. "What do you make of that?"
Dr. Cathcart looked at him and raised his eyebrows.
"Odors," he replied, "are not so easy as sounds and sight of telepathic communication. I make as much or little, probably, as do yourself."
He was not quite so glib as usual with his explanations. That was all. At the fall of day, cold, exhausted, famished, the party came to the end of the long portage and dragged themselves into a camp that at first glimpse seemed empty. Fire there was none, and no punk came forward to welcome them. The emotional capacity of all three was too overspent to recognize either surprise or annoyance. But the cry of spontaneous affection that burst from the lips of Hank as he rushed ahead of them towards the fireplace came probably as a warning that the end of the amazing affair was not quite yet. And both Cathcart and his nephew confessed afterwards that when they saw him kneel down in his excitement and embrace something that is reclined, gently moving beside the extinguished ashes, they felt in their very bones that this something would prove to be Defago. The true Defago returned, and so indeed it was. It is soon told, exhausted to the point of emaciation, the French-Canadian, what was left of him that is, fumbled among the ashes, trying to make a fire, his body crouched there, the weak fingers obeying feebly the instinctive habit of a lifetime with twigs and matches. But there was no longer any mind to direct the simple operation. The mind had fled beyond recall, and with it, too, had fled memory. Not only recent events, but all previous life was a blank. This time it was the real man, though incredibly and horribly shrunken. On his face was no expression of any kind whatever, fear, welcome, or recognition. He did not seem to know who it was who embraced him, or who it was that fed, warmed, and spoke to him the words of comfort and relief. Forlorn and broken beyond all reach of human aid, the little man did meekly as he was bidden. The something that had constituted him individual had vanished forever. In some ways it was more terribly moving than anything they had yet seen. That idiot smile as he drew wads of coarse moss from his swollen cheeks and told them that he was a damned moss-eater. The continued vomiting of even the simplest food, and worst of all, the piteous and childish voice of complaint in which he told them that his feet pained him, burned like fire, which was natural enough when Dr. Cathcart examined them and found both were dreadfully frozen. Beneath the eyes were faint indications of recent bleeding. The details of how he survived the prolonged exposure of where he had been, or of how he covered the great distance from one camp to the other, including an immense detour of the lake on foot since he had no canoe, all this remains unknown. His memory had vanished completely, and before the end of the winter, whose beginning witnessed this strange occurrence, Defago, bereft of mind, memory, and soul, had gone with it. He lingered only a few weeks, and what Punk was able to contribute to the story was no further light upon it. He was cleaning fish by the lake shore about 5 o'clock in the evening, an hour, that is, before the search party returned, when he saw the shadow of the guide picking its way weakly into camp. In advance of him, he declares, came the faint whiff of a certain singular odor. That same instant, old Punk started for home. He covered the entire journey of 3 days, as only Indian blood could have covered it. The terror of a whole race drove him. He knew what it meant. Defago had seen the Wendigo.
Once again, thank you for joining us for this. We hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, please leave us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening, and a quick review also goes a long way. It doesn't have to be anything important. You could say whatever you want. You could say zippity-doo-dah. We really don't care, but it definitely helps us a lot.
And as always, the intro was provided by Travis Bilger, and artwork was provided by Mark Parlier Jr.
Once again, please join our Discord. Link to it will be in the description of the episode. Thank you and good night.
Good night.